Hello everyone! I hope you're all having a wonderful Saturday, and don't worry, there won't be any photos of Boris Gelfand popping out in this video. I double checked. Although, if you think about it, it's hard to say if that's a plus or a minus for a video. But as we've said, we are going to show two more games from round 6 of the 2013 Candidates Tournament. Here we have a game between Teimour Radjabov and Levon Aronian. Now, it's really an intense game. The game lasted for almost 7 hours. And there will be a question for you at the end of this video. Did skill decide this game or did luck decide this game? But we'll get back to that. So Radjabov has the white pieces, and before we show the game, we do have some photos, only two unfortunately. A nice close-up of Levon Aronian. It's a photo taken before the game, and here we have a photo of two of them playing. It's the middle game is on the board, and in the back you can see Svidler and Carlsen, but you've already seen that game in my previous video. So let's see the game. Radjabov opens with e4, we have e5, knight to f3, knight c6, and bishop to b5. So once again, the Ruy Lopez. Knight to f6, the Berlin defense, d3, and bishop to c5. c3, and we have castles. Now, for those of you who are maybe new to chess, instead of this c3, you might think, why not simply eliminate the defender of the e5 pawn and then grab the pawn? Well, this would in fact lose you the game, because now if you capture and knight captures here, you get queen to d4, and now black is threatening checkmate and also threatening to grab a piece on e5. And after we play bishop to e3, captures, now d4 doesn't help you, because bishop to b4 check, c3, and now queen captures on e4, and if you decide to win back your piece, then after bishop to g4, queen moves and queen captures on g2, white will have a terrible game. Rook f1, bishop to h3 is coming. The only way to defend here is queen to e2, and after queenside castle, it's a terrible position for white. Black will win even more material, and this king is really looking silly on e1. So don't do that. c3 instead. We have castles, castles by both sides, rook to e8, and now knight b to d2. a6, bishop to a4, now the immediate b5, bishop to b3, and d6. Rook to e1, bishop to e6, offering a trade of bishops, and knight to f1. Bishop captures, pawn captures. So deciding to trade off the light square bishop, but now Aronian gave Radjabov a semi-open a file for the rook. But in exchange he does get to push d5, so a nice central thrust. Queen c2, we have h6, knight to g3, and now a5. h3, queen to d7. Bishop to e3, offering a trade of bishops, and here Aronian makes a very interesting decision. Instead of trading off the bishops, he plays bishop to f8. This knight is coming to f5 at one point, certainly, and this bishop will be very useful in guarding g7, h6, and controlling this knight in general. So rook 8 to d1, rook 8 to d8, and now knight does come to f5. Queen to e6 and g4. D captures on e4, D captures on e4, and knight to e7. We have rook captures on d8, rook captures on d8, and now rook to a1. As the pawn on a5 is no longer defended, and now Radjabov forces Aronian to move the rook away from the open d file. Rook to a8, and now comes c4. b4, Aronian doesn't want to exchange pawns and allow Radjabov to undouble his b pawn, and now comes g5. H captures on g5, knight captures on g5, attacking the queen, and now queen to c8. Knight to e7, capturing. We have bishop captures, and now comes king to h2. Radjabov now makes room for the rook to come to the g file, and he wants to start an attack on Aronian's king. We have rook to a6, and now rook to g1. So this rook is now very nicely placed. Queen to e2 is coming with ideas of maybe queen to h5 if this knight ever moves, but in order to get the a6 rook into the game with this nice rook lift, first Aronian goes knight to d7. Now the rook is free to enter the defense. Queen to e2, we have rook to g6, and now comes queen to h5. Knight back to f6, attacking the queen, queen back to f3, and now rook to h6. And now both the rook and the queen from c8 are eyeing that h3 pawn. It would be very dangerous if maybe this knight moves, and if the queen isn't protecting it, the white king is somewhat open. So here Radjabov finds a very nice idea. Knight to e6. Knight to e6, of course, now this opens up the attack from the bishop to the rook on h6, and of course you will not be able to capture back because the rook on g1 is pinning the pawn. But Aronian finds an excellent defense for this. Simply rook to h7. Now the g7 pawn is defended, and this knight on e6 isn't really doing all that much. So knight back to g5. We have rook to h4, and now rook to a1 would have been an interesting choice, because now you really force Aronian once again to defend the a pawn with queen to a8, and then white can simply continue the game. And this is something that the quote above the board refers to: even a poor plan is better than no plan at all, and it's something Nigel Short and Lawrence Trent said after the game, as they were the official commentators of this tournament, that it really seemed like Radjabov didn't have any plans during this game. So he played rook to g2, queen to d7, and now rook back to g1. We have g6, and now bishop to c1. Again, rook to d1, maybe attacking the queen, placing a rook on an open file, but even this, after the queen moves, the rook really doesn't have all that much to do on the open d file. No squares are available for it. So instead, bishop to c1, we have queen to e8, and now bishop back to e3, and now a4. Pawn captures, queen captures, and now bishop to c1, once again defending the b2 pawn. And the b3, now Aronian is attacking Radjabov's c4 pawn. Queen to g3, first attacking the rook on h4, rook to h5, and now queen to d3, defending the c4 pawn. Queen to c6, now the c4 pawn and the e4 pawn are somewhat weak, and Aronian will try to create some chances against either of these pawns. Bishop to e3, now rook to h4 with a triple attack on this e4 pawn, and here a very interesting defense. Queen captures on b3 was possible, but now after knight captures, and rook captures, that queen is really out of the game, and like we said, this king is somewhat open. Maybe it is possible to defend this, but in a practical game, especially when you're very low on time like Radjabov was, not really. So after rook to h4, we have king to g3, a very nice defensive idea. Now, if you play something like knight captures with ideas of maybe winning a pawn here and even sacrificing a rook on h4, it doesn't really work, because after king captures, even though you're pinning this knight and attacking it twice, and it's a really ugly square for the king, the king is actually perfectly fine on h4, and you just lost an entire rook for nothing. So white would be winning here. So after king to g3, we have rook back to h8, king to h2, and now king to g7. We have c5, queen to a4, and queen to c3. So defending the position, and like we said, Radjabov was really low on time here. And this is move 46. What's the idea? Why can you capture on e4 after queen to c3? Well, if you decided to do this, for example, knight captures on e4, you get queen captures on e5. Now there's the bishop on e7 that's attacked, and also the knight on e4 is attacked twice, and you can't save both. After bishop here, simply queen captures, and you just won a piece. White would be completely winning here. So after queen to c3, first rook to e8. Now kind of preventing this pawn from the queen from capturing on e5. Now, of course, if queen captures, then bishop to d6 wins the queen. You have to capture the bishop, and then simply rook will capture on e5, or some other way, but the queen is surely lost. So after rook to e8, we have queen back to d3. Rook to d8 now, attacking the queen, and queen back to c3. Queen to b5, now comes king g2, and rook to d3. So the position is better for black, but it's hard to say is it winning yet. But definitely in time pressure, it's hard to find the moves here. Queen to c1, we have knight to h5, and now comes knight to f3. Queen to b4, queen to e1, offering a trade of queens. Of course, if you capture on e4, then all of you see the idea, what Radjabov had in mind. Simply bishop to h6, opening up a discovered attack to the queen. Now Aronian loses the queen and the game. But after queen e1, we have queen to a4. And here again, the most critical moment of the game. What do you do here? In the game, queen to e2 would have been an interesting choice. Simply guarding the b2 pawn, attacking the rook, forcing black to do something, either move the rook back or bring the queen back, sorry, to defend the rook. But in the game, a most interesting thing happened. Radjabov actually played knight captures on e5. And in time pressure, things like this will happen. It seems like there's no really, there really isn't a way for black to capture this, check the king, and then win the knight on e5, because you always have this bishop to h6 check. But the problem is, Aronian did play queen captures on e4. This was with check, and now you'll see the problem. King to f1, of course, doesn't work. If you play king to f1, then queen can actually capture on e5, because now after bishop to h6 check, you don't lose the queen, because black can simply play king to f6. Now the queen is defended, and even after bishop to g5, you're still not gonna react to this. Simply king to e6. And now white will have to play queen captures, king captures, and now after you win your piece back, now rook to d1 check, king moves, knight f4 check, king moves, and rook to d2, and this will be a winning endgame for black. There's not much white can do here. So after this queen captures on e4, Radjabov decided to play knight to f3. And here it seems like, okay, you grab the pawn, I grab the pawn, everything is well. But the problem is, here Aronian played knight to f4, and after this move, Radjabov resigned the game. Why did he resign the game? Well, it really doesn't matter what you do. The most obvious idea, of course, bishop captures on f4 leads to queen captures on f3 with check. And now if you go to h2, then queen captures on h3 will be checkmate. And of course, if you go to f1, then surely all of you can see it. Rook to d1 wins the queen and the game. If you don't capture, doesn't really matter. You don't really have a move here. You're in check. If you move away from the knight, the king is the only piece that's defending the knight, so queen captures knight would simply be played. Your only idea is king to g3, but of course then you have a king on g3. And black has a lot of winning ideas here, but the most simple one is bishop captures on c5. Next, black can either capture here, or even better, play bishop to d6 and create all sorts of threats. For example, h4, white doesn't really have a move here, bishop to d6, and now simply everything wins. Knight g5, white can attack the queen, but now comes rook captures on e3 with check, captures, and knight to d3. All of the squares are taken away from the white king, only square available is king to h3, and now comes queen to f5 check, simply moving the queen away from the knight that was attacking it. King moves, and now knight captures on d2, and this will be checkmate. This will be you lose the queen and the game, and of course black is completely winning here. So yeah, after this knight to f4 move, Radjabov resigned the game, but it's very interesting because this is the move after this queen to a4 by Aronian. Knight captures on e5. Yes, Aronian did say in an interview after the game that he was only able to break through Radjabov's defenses because he was lucky, because Radjabov played this knight captures on e5 move, but it's not really something you can say lightly. I mean, Aronian was better the entire game. He had better time management the entire game, and he put pressure on his opponent for the entire game. And of course, under pressure from the position, from the clock, you simply crack, and you don't have time to calculate. So I don't think this can be characterized as luck, rather than, I mean, better game. But of course I could be wrong. I'm interested to hear what you think, and yeah, that's the game. Another game from round 6, and we will show one other game, the Kramnik versus Ivanchuk game, as that game is really insane. Chucky once again goes into time trouble, and Kramnik simply starts sacrificing pieces. Everything will be crazy, and you know, the outcome of the game is not even predictable. So yeah, once again, I do hope you enjoyed it. I would like to thank Matthew Goss, Vyacheslav Nemets, Andreas Bier, Guy Franklin, and William Fusco for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon with that wild Kramnik Ivanchuk game, also from round 6. Thank you all, and see you soon. Enjoy your Saturday.